The first time I realized just how unhinged my neighborhood HOA could get was the morning I found a handwritten sign nailed to the piling of my dock that read, in all caps, "Reserved for HOA use only." It was written in pink marker, half smudged from dew, and underneath it someone had drawn a crude little crown as if to underline the royal decree. The kicker? My dock sits squarely on the deeded slice of waterfront attached to my property. No easements, no shared rights, just me, the water, and a modest wooden dock I'd rebuilt myself after the last hurricane took it out. And now, apparently, the HOA had decided they owned it. When I saw it, I laughed, actually laughed out loud, because it was so absurd. A grown adult, presumably a neighbor, had walked down my yard, trespassed onto my dock, and posted a middle school-style, reserved sign as if we were fighting over cafeteria tables. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, and full of self-importance. I knew immediately whose hand had penned it. Marlene Henderson, HOA president, neighborhood tyrant, and self-anointed queen of the waterfront. Marlene was the type of person who introduced herself not just with her name but with her position on the board, as if it were a government office. She drove a spotless white Lexus SUV, wore sun visors like a permanent costume, and spoke as if every conversation were an official meeting that needed to be entered into the record. She also had a new obsession, yachts. 2 weeks earlier, she'd started boasting about how a very important guest was bringing their 50-foot yacht into our little bay. She sprinkled this tidbit into conversations at the community pool, during trash pickup, even at the grocery store. The way she spoke about it, you'd think a foreign dignitary was visiting. She wanted the yacht to dock somewhere befitting, as she put it. The problem was, the HOA doesn't own waterfront property. They manage the landscaping and the paint colors of homes, but docks? Those belong to the homeowners. Which is why I nearly choked when I saw her gaudy pink decree hanging off my piling. I tore the sign down, crumpled it in my hand, and went about my day. I figured she'd realize she had overstepped and let it drop. But that afternoon, as I was pulling weeds in the yard, Marlene herself appeared, visor shadowing her eyes, clipboard tucked under her arm like she was about to audit me. She didn't bother with small talk. She marched straight to the waterline, put her hands on her hips, and said, "You'll need to vacate your dock for the weekend. We have incoming traffic." I blinked at her. Traffic? What are you talking about? This isn't I-95, Marlene. It's my dock. Her lips pressed into a thin line. This community has been chosen to host the Spirit of Freedom, she announced, as though I should recognize the name. When I stared blankly, she sighed. A yacht. 50 feet. Very distinguished guests. They'll be attending a charity gala in the city, and I assured them they'd have docking here. You assured them, I repeated, deliberately slow. On my dock. She straightened. It's in the community's best interest to present ourselves well. You'll, of course, comply. I already made the reservation. That was the moment I realized she genuinely believed she could do it. This wasn't a prank. In her mind, her HOA title gave her the authority to commandeer my property like some medieval baroness conscripting the villagers' land. I kept my tone measured, calm, even friendly because people like Marlene feed off outrage. That's fascinating, I said. Because my deed doesn't mention any clause about docking space being up for community reservations. Maybe you should check yours again. Her eyes narrowed. Do you really want to be the neighbor who embarrasses us in front of distinguished guests? I shrugged. If the options are embarrassment or trespassing, I'll take embarrassment. She huffed, scribbled something angrily onto her clipboard, and stormed off. I figured that would be the end of it. But 2 mornings later, I woke to the sound of hammering. When I looked out my window, I nearly spit out my coffee. Marlene, along with 2 HOA board members, was erecting an actual metal, reserved docking sign at the top of my walkway. They had lugged it down like construction workers, cement bucket and all, and were setting it into the ground as if they owned the place. I stormed out, still in my pajama shorts, and demanded they stop. One of the board members mumbled something about community rights, while Marlene talked over him, repeating phrases like temporary requisition and public good. I told them plainly that if they didn't leave, I'd be calling the sheriff. They finished tightening a bolt, then walked off smugly, as though their sign magically changed the property lines. That night, I pulled the sign out of the ground, loaded it into my truck, and dropped it off at the county dump. Problem solved, I thought. But Marlene doesn't take no as a stopping point. To her, no is just an invitation to escalate. The next day, she started canvassing the neighborhood, telling everyone I was uncooperative and hostile to community events. A neighbor at the mailbox asked me why I was blocking charity. Another stopped me while jogging to ask if I really hated distinguished visitors. Marlene had spun some elaborate narrative in which I was the petty villain standing in the way of progress. And for some, it worked. She had a way of dressing her entitlement up as civic duty, and people wanted to believe her. But here's the thing. If you play chess against someone who thinks they're playing checkers, you don't get mad, you just set up the board. I knew she'd overplay her hand eventually. And when she did, I'd be ready. Sure enough, 3 days later, a glossy flyer appeared in every mailbox in the neighborhood. At the top, in giant letters, "Welcome the Spirit of Freedom." Beneath that, a photo of a sleek white yacht gleaming in the sunlight, champagne glasses on the deck. At the bottom, in smaller print, "Community docking space provided, courtesy of HOA." Marlene even scheduled a welcoming ceremony, complete with champagne and ribbon cutting, right there at the dock. My dock. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the flyer, equal parts amused and furious. It was so bold, so delusional, I almost admired it. She hadn't just reserved my dock. She'd printed a neighborhood-wide announcement inviting people to gather on it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an occupation. And that was when the idea hit me, not out of pettiness but out of sheer, strategic mischief. If Marlene wanted to play Queen of the Waterfront, maybe it was time I introduced her to a piece of reality she hadn't accounted for. Because while she had yachts and ribbon cuttings on her mind, I had something bigger, heavier, and far less glamorous in mind. Something that would change the entire game the moment it slid into the bay. I smiled, folded the flyer in half, and set it down. If Marlene wanted a spectacle, I'd give her one. A barge-sized one. By the time Saturday rolled around, my dock looked less like private property and more like a stage Marlene had rented out for her royal parade. I woke up to the sight of folding chairs being set up on my lawn without so much as a knock on the door. A caterer's van pulled into the cul-de-sac, unloading white tablecloths and silver champagne bucket. Someone even strung a banner between 2 oak trees that read, "Welcome, Spirit of Freedom." It was surreal, like I'd slept through a zoning change and woken up living in a country club. The audacity was breathtaking. My neighbors milled about, some avoiding eye contact, others waving sheepishly as if to say, "Sorry, but you know how she is." I didn't mind them. Most were caught in Marlene's current, afraid to fight back. What made my blood boil was the sight of Marlene herself, visor shining like a knight's helmet, strutting up and down the dock with a clipboard and barking orders. She was directing the placement of tables, scolding the caterer for using paper napkins instead of cloth, and repositioning chairs so the distinguished guests would have a perfect view of the water. Meanwhile, I was already 3 moves ahead. 4 days, I'd been making phone calls to a friend of mine, Eddie, who worked in construction and owed me a favor. Eddie had access to equipment most homeowners never think about, including barges used for hauling bulk materials along the bay. When I explained my situation, he nearly fell out of his chair laughing. "So this lady thinks she can steal your dock for her yacht party? You want me to park a barge there instead?" "Exactly," I said. Eddie whistled. "You're evil. I like it. When do you want delivery?" "Saturday morning. Sharp." So while Marlene was micromanaging hors d'oeuvres, I was standing on the deck of a flat, rusty, 30-ton barge making its way down the bay like a floating middle finger. Eddie was piloting, grinning like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for this kind of petty job. As we approached, people began to notice. The chatter around the chairs quieted. A few neighbors shaded their eyes against the sun. By the time the barge lumbered into full view, you could feel the unease rippling through the crowd. Marlene spotted it last. When she did, her visor nearly toppled off. She ran to the edge of the dock, waving her arms like an air traffic controller, screaming, "No, no, no! This is private use. This is a community event." I cupped my hands and shouted back, "That's funny, Marlene, because according to you, this dock belongs to the community now. So here's my contribution, a barge. Hope the yacht doesn't mind sharing." The barge groaned as Eddie maneuvered it into position, bumping gently against the side of my dock. The thing towered over the water, wide, ugly, industrial. Chains rattled, and seagulls circled, squawking at the commotion. Eddie dropped anchor, killed the engine, and gave me a thumbs up. It was perfect. Immovable, unsightly, and absolutely dominating the space where Marlene's precious yacht was supposed to dock. The silence that followed was glorious. My neighbors tried not to laugh. A few turned away, shoulders shaking. One kid whispered, "That's awesome," before his mother shushed him. Marlene, however, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. Her face flushed crimson. She pointed at me and screeched, "You will move this immediately! This is obstruction. This is vandalism." "Vandalism?" I called back. "It's a boat, Marlene. In the water. At my dock. Exactly what docks are for. If you want to talk vandalism, maybe we should discuss the illegal sign you cemented into my lawn last week." She sputtered, clipboard trembling in her hands. You can't just. This is sabotage." "That's one word for it," I said, leaning on the railing of the barge like a man enjoying a day cruise. "Another word is property rights. But hey, tomato, tomato." The crowd began whispering. Some people looked uneasy, worried this was going to explode into a lawsuit. Others were enjoying the show. After weeks of Marlene's tyranny, watching her deflate was like free theater. Then came the twist I hadn't fully anticipated. The yacht itself. Out on the horizon, cutting through the waves, was a gleaming white leviathan. The spirit of freedom, in all its gaudy glory, was approaching. It was enormous compared to the quaint little docks dotting our neighborhood, easily dwarfing every house on the shoreline. Its chrome railings sparkled. Its bow cut the water like a knife. And every eye in the neighborhood turned toward it. Marlene straightened, suddenly full of renewed purpose. She barked orders at the caterers, telling them to pop the champagne early. She shouted at me again, her voice cracking, "Move that rust bucket now!" But the barge didn't budge. Eddie gave me a wink and folded his arms. The spirit of freedom slowed as it neared, and I could see the crew on deck, frowning at the sight of our humble community dock blocked by what looked like a floating scrapyard. The captain raised a hand in confusion. Marlene, desperate, ran down my dock as far as she could, waving frantically at the yacht. "Over here. Welcome. We have it reserved." She shouted the word reserved, like it was a magic spell that would make the barge vanish. I couldn't resist. I cupped my hands and yelled across the water, "Sorry, folks. Dock's occupied. You'll have to find another spot." The crew of the yacht hesitated. They looked from Marlene to me to the barge, clearly unsure what drama they'd sailed into. Finally, with a shrug, the captain turned the yacht's nose and began to ease back toward open water. The sight of that gleaming beast retreating from our dock was like watching Marlene's entire fantasy collapse in real time. She screamed. I mean actually screamed, hands shaking, voice hoarse, shouting words I won't repeat because I'm pretty sure she invented new curse combinations that day. Then she rounded on me, her voice shrill enough to make dogs bark. "You've humiliated us. You've ruined everything. Do you know who was on that yacht? Do you have any idea the kind of connections you've just cost this community?" "Connections?" I said dryly. This isn't Davos, Marlene. It's a cul-de-sac in Florida. That line cracked a few neighbors. Someone snorted. Someone else coughed to hide a laugh. Even Eddie let out a booming chuckle from the barge deck. But Marlene wasn't done. She stomped off the dock, shoved her clipboard at one of the board members, and announced, "This is war. I will have you fined, sanctioned, and evicted if I have to. You think you're clever? We'll see how clever you are when the legal notices arrive." I leaned against the railing and called after her, "Better make sure they spell my name right. Wouldn't want the paperwork to get lost." The crowd slowly dispersed, whispering about the fiasco. Some shook their heads, others laughed quietly, and a few clapped me on the shoulder as they passed. The barge stayed put, looming like a silent guardian of my property. Eddie promised to leave it there for the week, plenty of time to make a point. That night, I sat on my porch watching the sun set over the hulking silhouette of the barge. It was ridiculous, petty, and absolutely perfect. Marlene had tried to stage a coronation, and instead, she'd ended up with a scrapyard centerpiece. By Monday morning, the barge had become a tourist attraction. Kids on bicycles stopped at the cul-de-sac to gawk. Neighbors slowed their morning jogs to snap photos. Even the local fisherman leaned on his truck one evening, laughing to himself and muttering, "Now that's one way to tell the HOA to shove it." The hulking steel slab sat in the water like a permanent reminder that my dock was not, in fact, a rental unit for Marlene's yacht fantasies. But Marlene wasn't laughing. I could practically hear her teeth grinding every time she drove past in her spotless Lexus, visor pulled so low it nearly covered her eyes. She didn't speak to me directly. Instead, she unleashed her preferred weapon, official letters. The first one appeared in my mailbox that Tuesday. It was on HOA letterhead, folded crisply into an envelope stamped, "Urgent." Inside, Marlene had typed a 3-page declaration accusing me of endangering community safety, violating aesthetic guidelines, and obstructing maritime access. She gave me 72 hours to remove the unsightly industrial obstruction from community space, or face daily fines of $500. I nearly choked on my coffee reading it. Community space? My dock was private property. There wasn't a single clause in the HOA covenants that gave them jurisdiction over it. I dug out my deed, reread the property lines, then laughed so hard my dog tilted his head in confusion. I didn't bother writing back. Instead, I made copies of her letter and taped them up at the community mailbox with my own handwritten note. "Fun fact: this dock belongs to me, not the HOA. Guess some people skipped reading comprehension." I signed it with a smiley face. The next day, Marlene sent round 2. This one was shorter, nastier. She accused me of public defamation of HOA leadership, and warned that I was creating hostility among neighbors. She demanded I remove my postings from the mailbox and schedule a compliance hearing. I left that one unanswered too. Because while Marlene was busy drafting threatening letters, I was busy with something far more effective: research. I'd already suspected the HOA didn't have any authority over my dock, but I wanted more than suspicion. I wanted ironclad proof. So I spent an afternoon at the county recorder's office, flipping through property records. Sure enough, every waterfront homeowner in our subdivision had explicit ownership of their dock listed in their deed. No shared rights, no HOA control. Just private property. I copied the documents, highlighted the relevant sections, and stuck them in a neat folder. Armed with paperwork, I could have confronted Marlene then and there. But I knew better. People like her don't back down just because they're wrong. They double down. And I wanted her to double down, because the further she went, the bigger the crater she'd dig for herself. And dig she did. That Friday, as the barge continued to float peacefully beside my dock, Marlene called an emergency HOA meeting in the community clubhouse. Flyers were stuffed into mailboxes. I decided to attend, partly out of curiosity, partly because I couldn't resist seeing what kind of circus she'd organize. When I arrived, the place was packed. Neighbors filled every folding chair, some standing along the walls. Marlene stood at the front like a general before battle, clipboard in hand, eyes glittering. Behind her hung a giant poster-sized photo of the Spirit of Freedom yacht, gleaming and pristine. Beside it was a photo of the barge, ugly and hulking, taken from the worst possible angle. She launched into her speech without pleasantries. "We have a crisis in our community," she declared. "One homeowner has chosen to disregard the good of us all, humiliating our neighborhood in front of distinguished guests and threatening our reputation as an elite waterfront community." I leaned back in my chair, amused. Elite community? Half the homes still had hurricane shutters missing from last season. She went on, her voice swelling with righteous fury. "This obstruction, this eyesore, is not just an affront to our community values. It is a hazard. It prevents emergency access. It lowers property values. And it sends a message to the outside world that we are disorganized and hostile." She pointed dramatically at the blown-up photo of the barge. Gasps rippled through the crowd, though whether from genuine agreement or just performance, I couldn't tell. Then she dropped her bombshell. "The board has voted to levy fines of $500 per day until the obstruction is removed. Furthermore, we are seeking legal counsel to pursue immediate injunctive relief." Murmurs erupted. Some nodded grimly. Others looked uncomfortable. A few glanced at me, clearly wondering how I'd respond. I stood slowly, folder in hand. "May I?" I asked. Marlene's eyes narrowed, but she gestured stiffly. "You may make a statement." Briefly. I walked to the front, opened my folder, and held up the deed copies for everyone to see. "This is the county record. It says, very plainly, that my dock is my private property. Not HOA common space. Not subject to community reservation. Private property." I passed copies down the rows. Neighbors bent over them, whispering. A few eyebrows shot up. "So when Marlene here tells you that my barge is obstructing community space, she's either misinformed or deliberately misleading you," I continued. "Either way, the HOA has zero legal authority to fine me for anything that happens on my dock. Zero. And if they try, I'll happily see them in court. Spoiler, the county records will win." I closed the folder with a snap. Now, if the real issue is that Marlene is embarrassed because her yacht party fell through, that's her personal problem, not a community crisis. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Marlene's face turned the shade of ripe tomatoes. She slammed her clipboard on the podium and shrieked, "This man is undermining community unity. He is a cancer to this neighborhood." But it was too late. The damage was done. People had seen the paperwork. They knew the truth. Even if some still feared Marlene, the invincibility of her authority had cracked. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some stormed out. Others lingered, whispering. Marlene stood fuming at the front, veins throbbing in her temples. I walked out calmly, my folder tucked under my arm like a trophy. I thought that might cool her off, but I underestimated her appetite for escalation. 2 days later, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. I stepped outside and nearly dropped my coffee. There, at the entrance to my dock, was a crane truck. Men in neon vests were unloading equipment, supervised by none other than Marlene herself. She was barking instructions, pointing at the barge. I stormed down to the waterline. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She turned smug. "Removing a hazard. You refused to comply, so the board authorized emergency action." The workers looked uneasy. One muttered, "Ma'am, we need legal paperwork for this." "Do it," she snapped. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff. By the time deputies arrived, the workers had barely hooked a chain to the barge. The deputies listened to both sides, then asked to see property records. I handed them my folder. They scanned it, nodded, and turned to Marlene. "Ma'am, this dock is private property. You don't have authority here. If you don't pack up this equipment, you'll be trespassing." Marlene's face twisted in rage. "This is an outrage. This is corruption." The deputies didn't flinch. Pack it up. By the time Marlene officially filed a lawsuit, I wasn't even surprised. I'd been expecting it like a thunderstorm after a week of suffocating heat. The barge still sat proudly at my dock, stubborn and immovable, while Marlene had grown increasingly unhinged. She no longer limited herself to clipped HOA letters or visor-shaded glares. She'd started cornering neighbors during their morning walks, ranting about how my industrial monstrosity was tanking their property values and how outsiders were already gossiping about our subdivision being a laughingstock. I got the court papers on a Wednesday afternoon, hand-delivered by a process server who looked exhausted before he even reached my porch. He handed me the envelope, muttered, "Good luck, buddy," and trudged back to his car. Inside was a stack of legal documents thick enough to choke a horse. Marlene, acting on behalf of the HOA, was suing me for violation of community standards, unlawful obstruction of maritime access, public nuisance, and reputational harm. Reputational harm. I had to read it twice before laughing so hard I nearly spilled my coffee all over the complaint. Who exactly had suffered harm? Marlene's fantasy yacht guests? The caterer stuck with unused champagne? Still, a lawsuit meant business. I called my friend Eddie, barge delivery specialist turned cheerleader in this saga, and told him the news. "Man, she's really going for it," he chuckled. "You gonna fight?" "Of course," I said. "But I'll need a lawyer who enjoys sharpening their teeth on HOA boards." I found one, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Danielle Pierce. She specialized in property disputes, and when I laid out the story, dock, barge, yacht, HOA queen, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is either the dumbest thing I've ever heard, or the most fun case I'll get this year. Possibly both. I'll take it." She flipped through Marlene's complaint, shaking her head. "Half of this is word salad. The other half is flat-out unenforceable. They're banking on intimidation. People usually cave when they see legalese. But you've got the deed, the records, the sheriff's backing, and a literal barge to prove your point. This case is a bonfire waiting to happen, and they're standing right in the gasoline." Court was scheduled 3 weeks out. 3 long weeks during which Marlene did everything she could to turn the neighborhood into a pressure cooker. She circulated flyers claiming I was costing everyone thousands in lost equity. She held special meetings, where she ranted about outsiders laughing at us. She even started an email chain accusing me of deliberately inviting industrial pollution into our bay. But here's the thing, cracks were forming. At first, most neighbors kept their heads down, not wanting to cross Marlene. But after the sheriff incident with the crane, people had started questioning her judgment. Then the lawsuit hit and whispers began. Wasn't this overreach? Could HOA dues even cover legal fees? Did they really want to risk a court case over one guy's dock? By the second week, I had quiet supporters. One neighbor, a retired Navy man named Tom, knocked on my door with a grin. "Son, I don't like barges much. Ugly things. But I hate power-hungry busybodies more. You stand your ground. If you need me to testify, I'll be there." Even better, Danielle uncovered something delicious. The HOA board hadn't properly voted on authorizing the lawsuit. Marlene had railroaded it through with only 2 other members, neither of whom bothered to review the filings. That meant the case itself was shaky before it even hit the courtroom. The day of the hearing, the courthouse lobby looked like a reunion. Half the neighborhood had shown up, curious or giddy. Marlene arrived in a tailored blazer, her visor mercifully absent for once, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. She strutted in with the air of someone about to argue before the Supreme Court. I walked in behind Danielle, calm as ever, the folder of deeds tucked under her arm. When the case was called, Marlene launched into her performance. She painted me as a reckless saboteur who had defiled the aesthetic harmony of the community, scared off distinguished guests, and single-handedly tanked property values. She even waved blown-up photos of the barge like exhibits in a murder trial. Her voice quavered with outrage, trembling on the edge of tears. The judge, a patient older man with glasses slipping down his nose, listened without interruption. Then he turned to Danielle. She rose, smooth and deliberate, and handed over the county records. Your Honor, the deed is explicit. The dock in question belongs solely to my client. The HOA has no jurisdiction. Their bylaws don't extend to privately deeded waterfront structures. This is confirmed by the county. Additionally, the sheriff's office has already reviewed this matter and confirmed my client's right. The HOA's claim of authority here is, frankly, baseless. She paused, flipping through Marlene's complaint. As for claims of reputational harm, there is no legal basis. Courts don't adjudicate hurt feelings from failed yacht parties. A ripple of laughter passed through the spectators. Marlene stiffened, her lips tightening. Danielle continued, her tone sharpening. And finally, Your Honor, we submit that this lawsuit was filed without proper board authorization, meaning Ms. Henderson acted unilaterally, exposing her HOA to liability for misuse of funds and frivolous litigation. That got everyone's attention. Neighbors leaned forward. The board members who had shown up looked pale. The judge adjusted his glasses, tapped his pen, and sighed. I've reviewed the documents. The dock is clearly private property. The HOA has no authority here. The fines are invalid, the claims of obstruction irrelevant. This case is dismissed, effective immediately. Furthermore, I strongly recommend the HOA review its leadership procedures to prevent this kind of wasteful action in the future. The gavel fell with a sharp crack. Case closed. The room erupted, half with muffled laughter, half with angry muttering. Marlene stood frozen, clipboard trembling in her hands, as if her entire world had just been ripped out from under her. Her eyes darted around, searching for allies, but even the board members avoided her gaze. Danielle turned to me, smirking. That, she whispered, was easier than I expected. Outside the courthouse, neighbors swarmed. Some congratulated me outright. Others whispered about dues being wasted on legal fees. One even muttered, I'm calling for a board vote tonight. Marlene stormed past, muttering under her breath about appeals and corruption. But her power was broken. She'd overreached, overplayed, and lost in front of everyone. The queen had been dethroned, and the court had hammered the nails into her coffin. Still, I wasn't naive. Marlene wasn't the type to disappear quietly. People like her never admit defeat, they simply change the battlefield. I figured she'd retreat, regroup, maybe launch a whisper campaign. What I didn't expect was her final act, a desperate, reckless move that would turn everything on its head. That night, as I sat on my porch sipping a beer, the barge looming proudly in the twilight, I noticed unusual activity near the shoreline. Shadows moving. Flashlights flickering. I set down my drink, stood, and squinted. And then I realized what I was seeing. Marlene. With bolt cutters. By the time the deputies arrived, Marlene and her two cronies were still fumbling with the chains like amateur burglars. From my upstairs window, I had a perfect view of the spectacle. 3 HOA board members in khakis and boat shoes, crouched at the waterline, grunting and sweating as they tried to cut through a chain that was designed to withstand hurricanes. Their flashlights bounced off the barge's steel hull, casting long shadows across the bay. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so dangerous. If they actually managed to sever the chains, the barge could drift into neighboring docks, smash pilings, or worse, careen into the marina a mile down. I kept my lights off, letting the sheriff's deputies roll up without warning. The first cruiser's headlights swept across my yard, catching Marlene mid-swing with the bolt cutters. She froze, the light pinning her like a deer on the highway. One deputy shouted, "Hands where we can see them." Panic rippled through the group. One board member immediately dropped his flashlight and held up his hands. The other tried to scramble away but tripped on a coil of rope and fell hard on his side. Marlene, however, did what Marlene always did. She doubled down. She straightened, bolt cutters still in her grip, and shrieked, "This is community business. We are authorized. He has sabotaged us, and I am restoring order." The deputy approached calmly, hand resting on his holster. "Ma'am, put down the cutters." Marlene's voice rose to a near hysterical pitch. "You don't understand. This man has humiliated us, destroyed our reputation. That monstrosity is a blight, and I am fixing it. I am president of this association." The deputy didn't flinch. "Ma'am, the only thing you're fixing right now is a charge for criminal mischief. Put down the cutters." For a second, I thought she might actually lunge at the chains again, but one of her cronies tugged her arm, whispering frantically. Finally, with a theatrical groan, she tossed the cutters into the grass. The deputies corralled the three of them away from the dock. I stepped outside, deliberately calm, hands in my pocket. One deputy turned to me and said, "You the property owner?" "Yep," I said. "And the one who called this in. They've been trying to sabotage my barge all night." Marlene exploded, pointing at me like an Old Testament prophet. "He's lying. He's been lying from the start. He tricked you all. That dock belongs to the community." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "We already confirmed ownership with the county, ma'am. You don't have jurisdiction here." Her face contorted, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. Instead, she hissed, "Then I'll take this to the state. To the governor if I have to." The deputies exchanged a look that screamed, "Here we go again." They took statements, logged the bolt cutters as evidence, and told Marlene and her cronies they'd be receiving notices for trespassing and attempted vandalism. The officers didn't haul them off in cuffs. That would have been too clean an ending, but they may as well have. The humiliation was complete. The entire neighborhood would know by morning. And they did. By sunrise, photos were already circulating. Someone had snapped shots of the deputies' cruisers parked at the cul-de-sac, lights flashing against the water. Another had captured Marlene's face mid-scream, contorted and furious, with the barge looming behind her like a monument to her failure. Within hours, the HOA Facebook page was a war zone. Some defended her. She was only doing what she thought was right. But far more condemned her reckless stunt. The tipping point came when Tom, the retired Navy neighbor, posted a calm, scathing summary of the whole saga. He outlined how Marlene had overstepped, wasted HOA funds on a frivolous lawsuit, and finally risked lives by trying to tamper with a vessel at night. He ended it with, "If this is the leadership we want, we deserve the ridicule we've earned. Otherwise, it's time to vote for change." That did it. By the next board meeting, the room was packed wall to wall. People who hadn't shown up in years came, arms crossed, faces stern. Marlene tried to gavel the meeting into order, but the crowd drowned her out. One homeowner after another stood and demanded her resignation. They cited the wasted dues, the lawsuit, the trespassing charges. Even her loyalists fell silent. Finally, a motion was made, vote of no confidence. Hands shot up across the room, one after another, until the count was undeniable. Marlene was out. She left the clubhouse in silence, her clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. No visor, no entourage, no speeches. Just a woman stripped of her throne, staring at the pavement as if the ground itself had betrayed her. The new board wasted no time. They rescinded all fines levied against me, issued an apology letter to the entire community, and, most satisfying of all, cut HOA dues slightly after canceling the legal fees Marlene had secretly authorized. The sense of relief in the neighborhood was palpable. People smiled more. Barbecues popped up again. For the first time in months, it felt like a community instead of a battlefield. As for the barge, Eddie came back with his tug and hauled it away once the point had been made. My dock, once again quiet and unobstructed, felt almost too peaceful without the hulking steel beast guarding it. But the legend remained. Neighbors still joke about the barge incident at block parties. Kids draw crude little barges in chalk on the sidewalk. One evening, Tom raised a beer to me and said, "You know, that barge did more for this neighborhood than any HOA president ever has. It united us, just not in the way Marlene planned." I laughed, clinking my bottle against his. Guess you could say it docked us together. But if I'm honest, my satisfaction didn't come from the barge, or even from beating Marlene in court. It came from watching her facade crack. 4 years she'd ruled by fear. Fear of fines, fear of humiliation, fear of endless letters and threats. She thrived on people backing down. But the moment someone stood their ground, her power disintegrated. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't even a good strategist. She was just a neighbor with too much time, too much ego, and a clipboard she thought was a crown. The last time I saw her, months later, she was walking her dog along the bay, avoiding eye contact with everyone. No visor. No clipboard. Just Marlene, shrunken and ordinary, a relic of a reign no one missed. As for me, I still sit on my dock some evenings, beer in hand, watching the sun set over the water. Every now and then, I'll think about that ridiculous flyer she printed, the one promising a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a yacht that never came. And I'll smile. Because while Marlene wanted to bring prestige to the neighborhood with champagne and ribbon, I did it with a rusty 30-ton barge. And the truth is, I wouldn't change a thing.